50-year commemorative vignette for today. On or about this date in 1945, the Nazis murdered 497 Jewish forced laborers in Bratislava, Slovakia, at the approach of the Soviet army. And the Jewish inmates of the Ohrdruf labor camp in Germany set out on foot for the Dachau concentration camp. 500 perished on the way.
Alison Owings is primarily a freelance television news writer and reporter. She has worked with people on NBC and CBS, names of which I know are familiar to all of you. Tom Brokaw, Charles, Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, Ed Bradley, and so forth. She worked as a writer for CBS News Convention on election coverage from 1974 through 84. She's received many awards and grants. I don't want to spend time enumerating you. And she's written 2 books. The first is the Wonder Woman's Phrase Book, How to Meet and Avoid People in 3 Romance Languages. That was published in 1987 by the Shameless Hussy Press. The most recent book, the one that Professor Beard has already told you about, Frauen, about German women who recall the Third Reich, has recently come out in paperback, and you already know that. She will be speaking first. However, I will give you Professor Brenner's biography now so that I don't have to introduce again later on. Professor Brenner is a native of the San Francisco area. He studied at the University of California, where he taught in the Department of Near Eastern Studies from 1956 until his retirement in 1991. He served several times as chair of the department while teaching Arabic and Islamic studies. Professor Brenner was also a visiting professor at Harvard, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, University of Washington, and at 3 Israeli universities. In 1992-93, he served as acting director of the Adler Research Institute. Beginning in 1950, Professor Brenner spent a number of years in the Middle East, carrying on research, teaching, or administering various academic programs. From 1966 to 70, he was director of the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad, which was founded at the American University in Cairo. And from 1973 to 75, he served as director of the Overseas Studies Center of the University of California at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Brenner has published extensively on modern Arabic literature, medieval Islamic history, and religion. He has also commented on contemporary political developments in the Middle East, both on radio and television, and in a number of publications. He is active nationally as well as locally in various scholarly societies and in many community organizations. He will be our second speaker. So I now present to you Alison Owings.
Oops. Thank you very much, Ms. Zucker, and thank you, Professor Beard, and thank you all for being here. I should tell you from the outset that anything I say is really filtered through my rather finite expertise, at least in comparison to Professor Brenner's. What I really know about experiences of some elderly, non-Jewish German women during the Third Reich. And what else I know about the Holocaust and the Third Reich really comes from my study of them. In the 9 years it took me to write this book, Frauen, a book, incidentally, I thought would take 1 or 2 years. And I should say, too, that to me, anything personal, anything in the personal sphere, as opposed to perhaps the music sphere in the Third Reich, is touched by what I think of as the 3 C's: complexity, complications, and contradictions. And the sense of the Holocaust in Germany today is really no exception to that. To the basic question of how much Holocaust consciousness is there, the answer is, in very rough terms, a lot. According to a pamphlet Professor sent me so that I would seem a little more academic than I am, because I am really a mere journalist, the American Jewish Committee conducted a poll a couple of years ago and found out that 87% of Germans essentially know what the Holocaust is. 92% know that Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau were concentration camps. 91% know what a yellow star meant in the Third Reich. This is in comparison, you might in knowing, to 42% of Americans who know what a yellow star is. And I was at the University of Mississippi last month speaking about Frauen and taught a journalism class because that is really my field. And at one point I used Crystal Night as an example of something, and which a term I assume by now is familiar to all of you. And the professor stopped me and said, wait a minute, who in this room knows what Crystal Night was? And it was seniors and about 25 students, not a single one had ever heard of Crystal Night. Now, granted, they weren't studying the Third Reich, but it just gives you an idea of how little is known in this country, even among college students, about the Holocaust. But then we come to the question, in my opinion, of what does knowledge really mean? A former SS officer living in Germany now could have a lot of knowledge about the Holocaust. An 18-year-old teenager in a rural town could have virtually no knowledge of the Holocaust. Let's say the town is Passau, and the young woman's name is Anna Rasmus, and she finds out things about the Holocaust and her town's involvement in the Third Reich that essentially make her flee town. This is indeed what happened to a woman, and the book she wrote, the movie about her, is called The Nasty Girl. But she might be someone in this poll who had no knowledge of the Holocaust. And I think more telling, perhaps even the numbers, is about knowing about it is what to do with the knowledge. Some 68% of Germans say they believe the Holocaust should be taught, that it's important, essential to be taught. I question this. I don't question the poll itself, but I think from my own experience of interviewing German women, elderly German women, I think a lot would be aimed to say, no, it shouldn't be taught. And I also wonder if the poll reflects the heterogeneous nature of Germany. I know a lot of people think it's all one country, all one folk, but there are, for instance, Turkish Germans, there are Afro-Germans, there are Germans of all sorts who would not fit the stereotype of the typical German. So I don't know what they would say if they were polled. And more important to me, the statistics, I must say, of who knows what about the Holocaust and what they think should be done with it, in terms of being taught, and in terms of being in the public eye, is what they really do with it in their own souls, how they react to what they know about the Holocaust. And for instance, I would direct your thoughts to the utterings of some public officials. I have found in my research that public figures, at least in Germany, have an enormous effect on public opinion. There is, of course, the famous speech 10 years ago by former President von Weizsäcker about the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II and the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And it is a speech that is inspiring, to say the least, and in which he essentially says, don't treat the Turks like you treated the Jews, and come to terms with what you're doing with your lives. The speech resonated so much to Germany that when I was there the next fall, it was being sold in phonograph albums on the street, and it was called Die Rede, the speech, and nobody had to ask what speech was meant. Everyone knew it meant Weizsäcker. And just last October, I was in Germany just before the elections, and I was in Munich the night before the elections and heard Theo Weigel, who is the head of the CSU. This is the Bavarian branch of Helmut Kohl's CDU. And it was essentially his big last speech before the election. And he spoke about his brother having been killed in France during the war. We'll never have war again. He was a little smug, I thought, and spoke, although he spoke somewhat emotionally about his brother. And then he spoke about the issue in Germany today. There's a big issue of violence regarding foreigners. Now, it was clear to me there had been, I don't know how many thousands upon thousands of attacks on foreigners in the last few years by neo-Nazis and others. And as a result of this, there were a lot of candlelight parades, torchlight parades against this. But the example Theo Weigel mentioned, the head of the party, was of a protest by a group of Turks about something in northern Germany, I believe. I don't have all the details. They stopped, they shut off an Autobahn, they blocked an Autobahn. German policemen were called, somehow a car was incinerated, and a policeman got badly burned. I mean, I'm sure I'm off on some of the facts. And Theo Weigel said, well, if these people don't know how to behave in this country, meaning the Turks, they should go back to where they came from. And there was huge applause. And I thought of all the thousands and thousands of attacks by Germans on foreigners, or on not necessarily foreigners, but second, third generation Turks. The only example this political leader gives is an attack by a foreigner of a German. And I thought it was horrendous myself. And I thought what contrast there is to the Weizsäcker speech. And these are public figures, and of course they resonate. They get reported, and people listen to their politicians. At least they do in Germany. Now we come to something I know a little more about personally, which is the non-public figure, which is, of course, women. And the German women I interviewed were influenced, I noticed almost immediately, by an enormous range of situations. They grew up in different parts of the country. They grew up in different religions. I'm talking just Christian and just Christian even, and this is in addition to Judaism. But there's the enormous chasm between Catholic and Protestant, so they felt at odds with each other. Different geographical, different sociological, different political backgrounds. They had very little in common. And one thing I noticed that they did have in common is that they all recalled the Holocaust. They all acknowledged that it happened. This was somewhat surprising to me, I must admit. At one point I thought they would pretend they didn't know anything about it. And I'm going to read you from some excerpts of what some of these women said to me so that you can just get a range of the I spoke with, and maybe by this range get an idea of the range of opinion in Germany today about the Holocaust. And mostly I spoke to the women about what they remembered when, what they did for the Nazis, what they did against the Nazis, what they did in spite of the Nazis, and a little less so about what they think about the Holocaust today, but that still came through. Now, there was one exception, one woman who did acknowledge the Holocaust. She was the most hateful anti-Semite I've ever encountered. She was astonishingly dreadful. She had me change her name. She said if I didn't, the Jews would come and get her, because she was telling me the truth. So I named her Frau Mund, which means mouth in German. It's just to be nasty, because she made me so nervous. Here's a little of something that she said. And I asked her finally, after a lot of her saying, her anti-Semitic spewing, what she knew about the gassing, because she did not mention this herself. She said, "It is said today human beings were burned. Human beings are burned today. They're put in an urn, and become a very small grave. It's the same in America. I was astonished by this. She, of course, just means regular cremation. That's all it was. And regarding that time, she continued, you have to think of it this way. In our village, diphtheria broke out. There was no serum. There was no doctor who could help. The same was the case in the concentration camps. The human beings there had diseases, diphtheria, typhus, and were weakened, one of her friends said. And were weakened, no, she repeated. And there were bombing raids. Many camps were bombed and people there were killed. Then the bodies were burned. Yeah, said her friend. Where should they bury them all? I asked Frau Mundt if she meant there was no. I do not want to strike that out. I do not want to strike that out. But how one suddenly can say, you gassed 6 million Jews. Where does this 6 million come from? They guessed, but there weren't 6 million in Europe, barely 2 million. And of them, there's still a long line today whom we did not kill. No, I killed none. This is also an example, as some of you, I'm sure, will recognize, of denial in its highest form. And I think it's also interesting to figure out sort of why she's saying what she's saying, and to me it's a psychological puzzle, but it's simply, and maybe I'm saying this simplistically, but it's simply in my mind so that she can live with herself. She can tell herself she didn't kill anybody, so therefore she's innocent. She can live with herself. Now, there were several women who spoke of the Holocaust in terms of how it changed their lives, how they really learned their lesson, and since that terrible lesson, they've become different human beings. Well, and I found with these women, you really have to listen closely to them. Now, one woman was a Frau Margaret Fischer, who astonishes a lot of historians in the United States because her husband is Herr Dr. Fritz Fischer, who is known as a very liberal history professor in Germany, and people are surprised at what comes out of Frau Fischer's mouth. She said that this is said at the end of the war, and she had been a big supporter of National Socialism, unlike her husband, who didn't like it much at all, and said to her when he'd come home on leave from the war, I don't see what this war is all about, we're going to lose it. And she was very much, although she said she was against the war, she was very much for Hitler and for the message, the idealistic net message, she said, of National Socialism. Nothing is more disappointing than throwing one's whole love and one's whole idealism and one's whole energy into having to discover afterward what had been negative and horrendous about it. You cannot imagine there were such human beings who really believed that now relationships among human beings would change for the better. Naturally, during the war, that had died out a lot. But in 1945, it all came over us. First, of course, the collapse itself, and then for the first time, the entire horrendousness. Then came all the trials. Everything was disseminated. All accusations were printed in detail in the newspapers. And that is when we became aware of everything that had happened and what they actually wanted. Never again in my life have I been that uncomprehending. That was bad. Naturally, one did not trust so easily. Our whole generation didn't. And she said, no more running after someone and saying, those are the ideals for you. This idealism we all had, when you get right down to it, was misused scandalously. Now, psychiatry students, psychology students, perhaps in the audience, will notice that I think, in my mind, what she's doing, I try to leave analysis to the reader, but to say what I think she's doing is basically saying her fault. She was misled. She was misused. And she also said she wondered why Hitler wasn't killed when he was during the assassination attempt in 1944, and that maybe the reason that he wasn't killed is that showed Germany they had to go the long way down to total defeat and then learn their lessons from there. However, when I talked to her a couple of years later, and we talked about, she is of the opinion that Jews and non-Jews are two separate races. This is a woman who says she has learned her lesson, and yet her mind to some, including me, really remains about the same as it was during the Third Reich. She said that she quoted a rabbi who allegedly told a German newspaper that if things don't stop, all the stories and documentaries and about the Holocaust, this is in the 80s, then we'll harm ourselves, she said. And she said people have said to her again and again this theme, and can't there be something else? This is a common thread among many of the women I interviewed. This immer noch, immer wieder, they say, that they cannot see why this has to be repeated all the time. And then I asked her if she thought German Christians and German Jews were really two different races. Yeah, that we're two races is completely obvious, but it is that human beings of other races live together. They can be mutually fruitful. One doesn't have to see the only one positively and the other negatively, but I am convinced they're different. This I must say really stunned me. Another woman who kind of fooled me, I should say, is a Frau Erna Tietz, who was an aircraft gunner in the Second World War and undoubtedly shot down American planes. She says she doesn't know for sure if she hit any, but she's trying. She was using the .88 caliber gun, which was very powerful. And she spoke to me at length about how she has learned her lesson, that now it doesn't matter if people are purple or green or whatever, she will open her heart to them, invite them into her home, show them hospitality, that she has learned their lesson. And she also told me of being in the living room with her sister one day together, and they never married, or she never did. She said her father once said, if you're not nicer to men, no one will ever take you, and she said that was fine with her, and that's the way it remained. And she describes very movingly seeing a film about the Holocaust, a documentary, and saying that they had to stop eating, that they silently took their plates into the kitchen and went back and watched this film. And she described in detail what she saw of bodies being burned, of the eyes of the survivors, and that she was so moved she called people the next day, told them this was a series apparently, although she wasn't sure which it was, that they had to see anything like that. If there was anything on television like that again, that they must see it. And I was quite taken. I thought, well, she certainly has learned what it was all about. She certainly has true Holocaust consciousness. And then, a couple of years later, I was there and having a little Abendessen with the sisters. And for some reason, I don't quite know exactly what the twist of phrase was, but somehow I just gathered a bit of racism from her. And they were talking about how Jews and non-Jews were different, were considered different then, and that kind of translates into are considered different now. And she said, like they're very good in Handel, which is a German word meaning basically dealing or trading, merchandising. There's not a best word for it, but I think dealing is what I usually use, or trading. Trading in animals and stores and so on, she continued. And they did have this entire special talent, she said, to close a good deal, that they can get profit from that and so on. Then afterwards they took advantage of many in that direction. The Jews were known for that. We already knew that. That is, when dealing with Jews, pay close attention. He always works happily for his own pocket. He always makes sure that he will get a big profit and take advantage of the others. Also, if it's not fair and he takes from them, I would like to say more money than it really should be. I was really stunned because she had convinced me that she'd learned everything I've said before, and then that just turned upside down. Now, in contrast, and there were many women in contrast, I would draw your attention to a woman I came to like very much personally, named Frau Martha Brixius, who was a librarian. She was, according to the Hitler stereotype, just the perfect Aryan Mädchen. She was tall and blonde and so forth. And she incidentally was drawn to National Socialism in 1928. And she came home and told her mother she'd made a donation for something for the Nazi cause. Of course, they weren't in power yet. And her mother said, "Stay away from those people. They will lead us all to war." And that is why she really never became a Nazi. Had her mother said, "Oh, that's a good idea," or had not spent any time with her, I think she very likely may have followed the Nazis. But this is one little example of someone who steps in early and does have an influence. And teachers sometimes had the same influence one way or the other. Now she maintained that she was so horrified by the Third Reich and so unable to do anything about it. And in fact, I call her a passive anti-Nazi. It's kind of a damning term, I know, but her feeling was, what could you do? She was terrified to do anything. She saw what happened to some people who did something, and she just wanted to protect her two young children. But she used the experience of the Third Reich and the Holocaust to change her life afterwards, and she basically didn't trust anyone or anything nationalistic after that. She still sends me letters in which she's upset with any kind of nationalism shown by the Germans or the Americans. She compared George Bush to Hitler. I think that was a little tough. Or to Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War. She thought it was just all nationalism and wouldn't ameliorate that at all. She was very upset with the unification of Germany because she thought that West Germans were treating the East Germans like their servants. She is very wary of the Greens movement because she thinks it's too nationalistic, too much of this made in Germany stuff for her. And so the Third Reich has changed her into someone who is constantly, I'd say constantly, a Holocaust. Then you get people who are affected so profoundly and so personally that is all they see. One woman, a Frau Riegel, her name is really Biegel, but she became somewhat senile after I tried to get her to sign a release form later, and so I changed her name, but I could tell you. And she incidentally went to school with Eva Braun, Hitler's girlfriend. It is astonishing to me what a small world that is. I knew someone who was in the same prison as Ilse Koch, and people who chatted with Hitler. I've talked to some of them. It seems like a terrifyingly small world to me. Anyway, Frau Riegel was madly in love with a man she married after their first child was born. He was a carpenter and a socialist, and he was drafted and was sent to Poland early on in the war, fought all the way through, hating Hitler all the time, according to her, and then was declared missing in action in March 1945. So she is a war widow, never remarried, they had two young children, and she sees all of her life in terms of her loss. And anyone who is better really earns her scorn in a way. And she is the only person who compared Nazis and Jews as being in the same line, because in her opinion they were all powerful. Nazis, Jews, and aircraft bombers. They all were hurting the little person on the ground, such as herself. And she spoke in a vaguely anti-Semitic way, and yet then would say something very similar about a Jewish shopkeeper she had known, about how they had gassed him, they took him away, she knew that. And then she said something like this that just made my jaw drop. Yeah, they treated the Jews badly, that was true. They had to wear the Jewish star, and then they had to stay home, even during the day. They were so afraid. Yeah, it went bitterly for them, the Jews. We felt sorry for them, you know, because they couldn't help it that they were Jews. She also said that the Jews are doing well in Germany, that they're on television and they're everywhere. And I said, how do they do their job on television? She said, oh, just like the Christians, no difference. Now, some of the women were quite reflective about what they had done and what they had not done. I'd say the person who was perhaps the most reflective is a woman named Frau Karma Rauhut. And she lived a strange existence. She was one of the youngest interviewed, born in 1926, so she was a schoolgirl when the Nazis came to power. She did brave things, to my mind. She thinks they're foolish now, but she once took a recording of the Threepenny Opera to school and played it to show that Jews could make pretty music. And she said she forgot all about it until a schoolmate told her this at a 40-year class reunion, and she was horrified that she'd been so stupid to endanger her parents that way. Her parents were somewhat like, she describes them as Peter Pan characters. Her father had a lot of brown connections, she said, which means Nazi connections. And he evaded the Nazis and yet apparently was involved in different aspects of the resistance. And she hated them, but she tried to flee with her parents into another world, just watching any kind of Hollywood drivel they could find, any kind of escapism. That was how they spent the Third Reich. And she said sex was only to give the Fuhrer children. And when you consider these insane punishments having to do with abortion and birth control and so on, they migrated into a KZ, a concentration camp for that. It was impossible living in the Third Reich, she said. She paused. These are all such things that seize your life. One cannot convey it to younger people today. They say you are insane. It is her opinion that you cannot convey the Holocaust to anyone who is not there, that it is simply indescribable. She said she has shown films to her grandchildren. They think it's just another horror film. They don't understand that this is reality because it is so difficult to convey. She also said that the Third Reich, living in the Third Reich, has changed that entire generation of Germans, including herself. She said she thinks that the Third Reich deformed people psychologically, that people who could make these compromises constantly. She said she grew up watching individuals repress everything. In a certain sense, we are all neurotics from it. We all learned, in part, to be dishonest and never have a good conscience. One always tried to repress it. I do it too. I certainly repress a lot of things because one always has fear and the feeling of guilt. And her feeling is that the entire nation, therefore, has lived a lie and still lives a lie. She said we all have feelings of guilt and we all had feelings of guilt. But at the same time, I know exactly the question to me was, what should we do? A Frau Frankenfeld, whom I interviewed, who had completely the opposite view, was a Nazi Party member, very active in the Nazi Party, worked in the women's division in Berlin, sort of as an advisor to home economics groups. And she said something that so infuriated me, I basically blurted out my response to her. She said that what the Russians did with their Eastern temperament, in their disposition von Natur aus, she said, the Russians were, whatever they did was far worse than anything the Germans did. And I said, worse than Auschwitz. And she paused, and then Auschwitz, I would like to say, is a thing unto itself, not to excuse, for God's sakes. Auschwitz is as bad as there is. She then went on to say, but Auschwitz is not all that there is, and look at all the things that we suffered too. She also maintains that the Holocaust is all that is discussed in Germany today, and that there are, she doesn't exactly say two sides, but that's not all there was in the Third Reich, that there were certain very positive things about the Third Reich. And, but one must look at what the Germans suffered. Now she herself, for instance, was raped along with her mother and her grandmother at the same time by Russian soldiers. And she is therefore, I think, in my opinion, like Frau Biegel, in that they can only see their own suffering and don't see other people's suffering. But she is very aware. She would be someone who would come out 100% in a poll of what do you know about the Third Reich, what do you know about the Holocaust. Her consciousness is very high, but her inner opinion is something else. Then there are women who fascinate me and make me weep, really, whom I interviewed, who did things against the Nazis, who risked their lives, who risked their family members' lives. And they didn't always know everything that was going on. One woman, a Frau Dr. Blersch, secretly treated mental patients that they would not be found by the Nazis and destroyed. And she only saw her first film to do with the Holocaust about 20 years ago. She just never happened to have seen any, but yet she fought the Nazis with all she had, really. Secretly treating people and also hiding German deserters in her cellar at one point. She and another woman, a sainted woman, in my opinion, really, Frau Erna Dubnak, who is coming to California next, her first trip out of Germany, are women who did more than I think I could have done, but of course you always ask yourself that and you don't know. Frau Dubnak hid her best friend, a Jewish woman, for 2 years in her apartment next door to Nazi neighbors. And she endangered not only her own life, but that of her son. And her husband, incidentally, was a German soldier away at the front. He knew his wife was hiding a Jewish woman in their apartment, and he helped get them food. This is part of the complexity of the Third Reich that is not uncommon, in my opinion. Frau Dubnak might, if polled, not know that much about the Holocaust, really, but she did know the danger. I asked her at one point, did you realize how dangerous it was, what you were doing? And she just went like this. So she knew. And yet she feels, and this is typical to rescuers in my understanding, she feels she did not do enough. When you ask her about the Third Reich and about what she did, she'll talk about her friend Hilda Naumann's cousin, who wanted to be hidden too, but Frau Dubnak said, I just did not have enough food to hide 2 people. So instead of being someone like Frau Mundt, who said she's basically a good person because she killed nobody, Frau Dubnak chastises herself for not having helped Hilda's cousin too. And I would like to read you finally from Frau Mariana Karlsruhen, one of the more romantic stories, I believe. She fell in love with a man who was half Jewish. The Gestapo found out about it, told her to break off the relationship. She refused. Her father was a factory owner. They told him they would disenfranchise him if his daughter did not stop seeing this man. She refused. Oh, it got very emotional. They went to Norway. She got pregnant. He got later in Germany, got arrested, was sent to a concentration camp. She gave birth toward the end of the war, not knowing if her lover was alive or not. And she faults herself, too. She said, with the knowledge of it all back then, with the alertness and knowledge I have now, I probably should have conducted myself considerably differently. I probably should have done something myself. I ask myself today, would I also have done it if it meant pledging my life? For one must include that if one is really committed. I sometimes still make self-reproaches that I did not intensively research what really was going on then. I believe if one really tried to get behind it, that it would have been possible. But as I said, I probably was too... In the meantime, a lot has been generated in me. It wasn't that far along before. So, I would say in summary, I would quote Professor Beard's question to me, which is, did I think that the German people are congenitally inclined, more than other peoples, to accept totalitarian governments, discrimination against minority groups, and the like? My answer, my personal opinion, is no, not at all. I could be wrong, but this is my, I would say, conviction. And are Germans culturally inclined to accept totalitarian governments and discrimination against minority groups? My answer is, that depends who talks to them Wow. Thank you. Well, we have time for a few questions. Yes. Yeah. CDU won. Theo Weigel is a very powerful man. He was then and he is more so now. Yeah. Yes.
In speaking, what experience did you find the most moving, whether it was positive or negative? If you could share that. Or that maybe, knocked you off your feet the most?
Boy, that's a great question. I think I was knocked off my feet by three things. I was knocked off my feet by the anti-Semitism, especially the stuff that I quoted, and also by the more subtle forms, such as, well, Jews are very gifted financially, but then you can't trust them, that kind of, that still is in so many people. And in my opinion, old Nazis remain old Nazis. And people who were humane then are humane now. I was knocked off my feet by some of the stories, some of the terror. For instance, a woman telling me of her woman in the bed next to her in a hospital in Berlin giving birth to a child, to a boy, in 1943, muttering, "More cannon fodder." She disappeared. Apparently, you can't say that. That was treasonous to say, so this mother disappeared. Just the sense of fear and terror with which the Nazis gripped the German people sometimes shattered me. This Karma Rauhut, for instance, the one whose family was sort of Peter Pan-like, her father was able to take a trip to Switzerland once, on a business trip in the 40s, during the war, went to a movie, and it was preceded by a newsreel. When he came back to Berlin, he had been reported to the Nazi authorities and had to go to the command to explain why he had seen a forbidden film in Zurich. So the spider web that Frau Rauhut talks about, that sort of shattered me. But I think more than anything, in a way, was women kind of, I think of in the middle, these passive anti-Nazis, or maybe even these fellow travelers who don't necessarily have education, who haven't thought about it too much, who found themselves, because of fate, in the middle of the Third Reich. That what shattered me is thinking, what would I have done, and how very much like Americans they seemed, how very middle class, just trying to get by and not get in too much trouble, that they were so much like us. I think that's what shattered me more than anything. Yeah. I chose the women by following every single lead I had. Professor Gordon Craig at Stanford University helped me a lot. He led me to Herr Dr. Fritz Fischer, who led to his wife. Once I was interviewing a woman and said, well, I'll be happy to talk with you, but I think you'd rather talk with my neighbor. And I said, why is that? And she said she was a guard. And everyone knew it in the neighborhood. And so I interviewed this concentration camp guard. One of the least anti-Semitic people I met, incidentally. Convincingly so. I don't know if it comes across, but she convinced me. She respected the women she guarded as being intellectually superior to her. They were Hungarian Jewish women. And she said they were so intellectual, they knew so much, they were so sophisticated, and that it was embarrassing for her, a poor village girl, to guard them. And sometimes I would just go into and find someone easily. They're all over. I mean, there are probably hundreds of thousands of elderly German women in Germany. And I always said to somebody, I didn't mean this facetiously, but it's not that hard. You go to Germany, you look for an old woman. I mean, they're everywhere. And getting them to talk is something else. But most I approached through an intermediary, one way or the other. And the intermediary sort of made me safer, I guess. And then they just started speaking. Once I live in Mill Valley myself, and once I Bank of America there, and I heard someone with a German accent, and I got talking with her, and yes, indeed, she was born in Germany, and yes, indeed, her mother was there during the war, and her mother's the second woman in my book, Frau Hafferkamp, with her 10 children. And my own mother, who was a woman with great humor, used to say that if someone says Gesundheit, Allison gets out her tape recorder, which was very close to the truth. I followed every lead I had. And then I should say I tried to fill in the gaps I didn't have. Like I did not have rescued somebody. And I was in touch with sort of a left-wing student organization in Berlin, and they led me to somebody who led me to somebody, and that's how I met Frau Erna Dubnak, my heroine. There were 5 people between us, I guess. Well, thank you very, very much.
Okay, I've been given the signal to begin, so I shall do so. I've been asked to talk about Holocaust consciousness in Israel. And I must say that if I had been asked to do this 15 years ago, my talk would have been very different from what it is today, because Holocaust consciousness in the Israeli population has undergone a tremendous change during the last decade and a half. 3 weeks from now, in fact I think about 3 weeks from tomorrow, throughout every city in Israel, air raid sirens will blow, and everywhere all traffic will come to a stop, people will get out of their cars, and everyone will stand silently for a moment. That is the day that is called in Hebrew Yom HaShoah, the day of the Holocaust. So everyone in Israel is aware of the Holocaust. The question is, how do they evaluate it? How do they react to it? And here you have some great ambivalence, because what Israelis were brought up on, and I'm talking now about the younger generation, what they were brought up on was an attitude of anger towards the victims of the Holocaust because they did not fight against the Nazis, because they were passive. What leads to this attitude? Why is it that this was the way in which the Holocaust was presented for many years in Israeli schools, on television, on radio, and so forth? And it has to do really with a reaction in modern times to an of the Jew that has a lot to do with what Miss Owings was talking about some of the German women whom she interviewed. When those German women said Jews are a different race, we have to realize that during the medieval period in Europe, Jews were indeed looked upon as a very different race completely unlike other human beings, because Jewish men were not really men. They menstruated. This was common knowledge during the Middle Ages. Jewish men were really women. And one of the things that happened with the European Enlightenment and the emancipation of the Jews in Europe was an effort on the part of Jewish men to assert themselves as men. And in some ways, that led to a type of machismo, a denial of everything feminine, an attitude that a real man wouldn't be passive. A real man would fight. A real man would stand up to the Nazis. And so an attitude that grew into a Jewish vision during the 19th century in Europe. For example, we look at the attitudes of the religious reformers among the Jews who tried to make Judaism a more modern religion. Their slogan was, "Be a Jew at home and a man in the street." A distinction, even in the eyes of Jews themselves. And Jews who were not religious, who were socialists or secular Zionists, all felt there's a different way. We have to assert ourselves. And to the Zionists, especially those who created modern Israel, the idea was that one had to be a pioneer, one had to be a worker, one had to be a fighter. That this was what being a man meant. Jews had to be men. And so the victims of the Holocaust were put into a different category. They hadn't acted like men, with the exception of a few outstanding examples of heroism. If you look at the settlements, the agricultural settlements created by survivors of the Holocaust who came to Israel, what are the names of those settlements? One of them in the north of Israel is called Lochamei HaGetaot, which means the fighters of the ghetto. And this was settled by and is dedicated to and has a museum about those people in the ghettos of Vilna and of Warsaw and a few other towns in Poland and Lithuania who actually fought against the Nazis until they were wiped out. The few who survived set up this settlement as a memorial to them. In the south of Israel, there is called Yad Mordechai, a memorial to Mordechai Anielewicz, who was the hero of the battles of the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazis. These were the only legitimate figures of the Holocaust. But something is happening in Israel today that is very strange, and it's bothering a great number of Israelis. And that is, heroes are no longer heroes. People who were looked upon as the heroes of Zionism, the heroes of the founding of Israel and of its building, are now being shown to have had clay feet across the board. Whether it was Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, whether it was David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, whether it was Joseph Trumpeldor, who was a great hero of the early days of the fight against the Arabs who destroyed Jewish settlements, every single one of them has been demoted. Every one of them has been treated in the same way that we are treating our political figures in the United States today. That is, we try to find out every bit of dirt about their personal lives. We spread it in all the newspapers. They are no longer worth paying any attention to because we know all the dirt about them. And that is what is happening in Israel today, and part of it is due to a very strange development, and that is the coming of the possibility of peace. Because while Israel was under constant threat of war, there were still heroes. One still believed in heroism, and one needed that particular example. But now with the coming of peace, first of all, people want to be comfortable. People want to be wealthy. People want to forget about heroism. There's going to be a new way of life. And something happened just this last November, and I happened to have been in Israel at the time so that I was able to observe this happening, and it was a very, very strange occurrence. Let me go back and give you the background of this particular occurrence. It took place in the 1940s, 1944, 1943. The Jews of Hungary had been more or less safe until about that time. By safe, I don't mean that there was no anti-Semitism, and I don't mean that they didn't suffer. Thousands of Hungarian Jewish men were put into labor battalions, in which many of them died from the type of work that they were forced to do, and so forth. My own family happens to come from Hungary, so I know from personal experience of my own family this type of thing that happened at that time. But it was only in 1944 that the Nazis really took over, and the Jews of every Hungarian village, because in Hungary almost every village had a Jewish population, and in some of them the Jews were as many as 30% of the total population of a village. Every village of Hungary were gathered up by the Nazis, were shipped off to Poland, were killed and incinerated in the concentration camps there. And all that was left was the Jewish population of the main city of Hungary, Budapest, which the anti-Semites called Budapest, because they felt that Budapest was so much under the influence of Jewish intellectuals, of Jewish businessmen, and so forth and so on. And at that time, one of the leading figures in the Hungarian Jewish community was a man named Rudolf Kastner. And Rudolf Kastner was contacted by Heinrich Himmler, who made a deal with him. And this was a program that was set up by the Nazi government at that time called Blut für Ware, blood for goods. That is, they would give Jews life in exchange for money or goods in order to carry on the war effort, which was going very badly at that time. And so Kastner was given the possibility of saving a certain number of Jewish lives if he would get money and trucks for the Nazi war machine. And he agreed. And he was given 80 Jews who had already been shipped off or were going to be shipped off to the concentration camps, and they were freed and they were permitted to leave the country, including himself. Now, it later turns out that those 1,800 people were his family, his close friends, and associates who had worked with him. He got to Israel eventually and became an important figure in the Labor Party of Israel, got a government position, and in 1954, in one of the newspapers in Israel, somebody wrote a scathing denunciation of Kastner, pointing out what he had done, how he had cooperated with the Nazis, and saying the only people he saved were people who were close to him in some way or another. He declared that this was a libel. He brought a libel suit against the person who wrote the article. It appeared in the court, and the court found for the man who had written the story. There was an appeal, but before the appeal could be heard, Kastner was assassinated. He was killed while walking in the streets of Tel Aviv by a man who had read that article, whose family had been killed in Hungary, and decided that he had to take vengeance. What happened last November was that this was made into a docudrama on the television. And the man who wrote the script for the television show added one little line that threw Israel into a frenzy, because he shows the trial for libel, and as Kastner talks about what he did, he says in passing, of course, Hannah Senesh, under torture by the Germans, betrayed all of her companions. One line. Who was Hannah Senesh? Hannah Senesh is one of the great heroines of the Holocaust in Israel. She was a Hungarian Jewish woman who had come to Israel in the 30s, settled in a kibbutz, and when the situation in Hungary became very bad, she volunteered to join a group that was established by the British Army to parachute into northern Yugoslavia and to make their way across the border in Hungary and make contact with those Hungarian Jews who were trying to save other Jews from the Nazis. Hannah Senesh parachuted into Yugoslavia, but as she crossed the border, she was caught by the Hungarian supporters of Nazis. There was a very strong Nazi movement in Hungary itself. She was tortured and she was killed. And in Israel today, one of the poems that she wrote is almost like a national anthem. It is sung by everyone. She is a heroine for all of Israel. And all of a sudden, in this television documentary or docudrama, which means it isn't necessarily, this line is put in, Hannah Senesh, of course, betrayed her friends under torture. This was never said during the Kastner trial. It was put in gratuitously, and the man who wrote the script later said, of course Kastner didn't say it. He says, but I thought that people should realize that heroes are not necessarily heroes. And so he picked on Hannah Senesh. Now what happened was that Hannah Senesh's brother was still alive, and he demanded in court that that line be omitted when the show went on television. And the court said, no, this would go against freedom of speech. He could go ahead and broadcast that line. This is before it even appeared on television. And then there was such a public outcry about it that it was omitted station that broadcast the show. I'm telling you all of these details because I happened to have been there at the time and was aware of this struggle that was going on over whether it could be said that Hannah Senesh had betrayed her companions. Now, I don't know if all of you know who Natan Sharansky is. Natan Sharansky was one of the great refuseniks in the Soviet Union, who eventually was let out of prison after years of there. And he wrote an article in the week of that show, which he called, Who's Afraid of Hannah Senesh? The question for me, he writes, is not whether TV screenwriter Moti Lerner should be allowed to make a disparaging reference to Hannah Senesh, but why he needed to do it. It's obviously senseless and unproductive to put any restriction on the right to criticize or debunk our state's symbols, or to try to sugarcoat history. But Lerner's line wasn't part of a search for truth. He has said he knew Senesh hadn't been accused of betraying her comrades. He wasn't trying to reveal new facts, but rather to create his own Hannah Senesh, a weak and broken woman, to undermine a hero who represents, in Lerner's words, Jewish self-sacrifice to the point of death. Now, this has become one of the great issues in Israel today. The idea that Jews sacrifice themselves to the point of death at various times in history when they should have fought instead. And one of the great victims of this particular idea is not only the Jews who died in the Holocaust, but, for example, those who committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans at Masada. It used to be that when new recruits were taken into the army in Israel, they would be taken to this mountain fortress where 980 Jews committed suicide when they were surrounded by the Romans and there was no chance for them to get out, rather than to become victims of a victory march in Rome of captives. These new recruits would be taken up to Masada, and there they would be sworn into the army. It was a symbol of Jewish courage. And it was turned into something completely different, so that now the army no longer does that. But something else has happened in line with this debunking, and that is, you may have noticed that just a few weeks ago, the Israeli Foreign Office announced that it would no longer require all official foreign visitors to go to Yad Vashem, that is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. It used to be that if any government representative came to Israel, the first place they were taken to was Yad Vashem to see the Holocaust Memorial, and then they would go through the whole routine of meeting the president or the prime minister and so forth and so on. That's no longer going to be required. And the statement that was made as to why it was no longer required, because we've grown up. We don't need this anymore. We don't have to show the world how much our people suffered before. The Holocaust, consciousness, something has happened there. And at the same time, there is a program that is called the March of the Living that takes place every year now, where young people, mostly universities from all over the world, last year there were 6,000 such students, including 600 from Israel, do a march from Auschwitz to one of the other Nazi concentration camps, death camps, and on the way, of course, they are given a wooden plaque with the name of somebody who died in the Holocaust, and as they march along the railroad tracks that go from one camp to another, they place these plaques along the railroad tracks. And somebody who was there said, some walk around numb, as if in a trance. Some weep uncontrollably. Others lose control of their muscles, and they remain standing with the help of friends. And so these young people are profoundly influenced by what they've seen, and the reaction of the former education minister of Israel, Shulamet Aloni, was that this event is simple flag waving that turns young people into right-wingers, and she wanted to have it stopped. And so when you talk about Holocaust consciousness in Israel, you see that there's still a battle going on, and it has to do with political matters, and it has to do with a way of looking at Jews in the world today. These young people were profoundly moved by the experience of being in the camps, of seeing where their relatives had been killed. One of the people who organized this March of the Living said, "The experience is too overwhelming not to leave a mark on a young person." Well, that's what some people seem to have been afraid of, that it might leave a mark on young people. One of the things that is happening, though, that I would say is a more positive development, is that there has been a recent proliferation of Israeli fiction by the younger generation of writers, people who did not experience the Holocaust, in some cases were not even born at the time of the Holocaust, who write in novels about what was once an untouchable subject except for Holocaust survivors. If Aaron Appelfeld wrote novels about the Holocaust, that was all right because he was there. But now you have young writers in their 30s writing about the Holocaust based on what their parents said or did not say. They are reacting to the experience of survivors who would not speak about their experiences, but whose experiences had a profound impact on their children's lives and on their children's sensibilities. We find that here in America now with the children of Holocaust survivors, all the more so in Israel, because there is a consciousness and a denial at the same time. So that a man who is probably the best novelist in Israel today, David Grossman, has written a chapter in a recent novel that has been translated into English under the title Seek Love, a chapter called Mummick, in which he talks about the unbridled imagination of a child about these unspoken horrors that traumatized his parents. Now, another writer, a woman, Yehudit Katzir, wrote a short story called Schlafstunde, part of the German national religion. That is the time of day when you take a nap in the afternoon. And that was brought over into Israel by the German immigrants to Israel, so that Schlafstunde is taken very seriously. There are places in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa where you cannot make noise between 2 and 4 o'clock because that's Schlafstunde and everything has to be quiet. Not that business doesn't go on and so forth, but if you live in an apartment house, you can't play the piano during that period because you might disturb the neighbors who are taking their afternoon nap. At any rate, she writes in a novel in a collection of short stories that she made in 1989, this particular story again, how a child of a survivor imagines what happened to the parents. Never talked about, they were never told, they imagined. And so the younger generation of writers is beginning to bring this to the fore, beginning to make Israelis aware of what had happened. My son's wife was the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She's an Israeli. And her mother died recently. Her mother was a slave laborer in a concentration camp in Poland. And her mother, in her last years in Israel, began to write poetry about her experience. And her daughter has just published that work. Interesting to see how it took 50 years for people to be able to talk about it, to write about it, and to really read about it and become aware. And yet there's tremendous opposition on the part of some people. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, has been slowly losing stature in the country until a new director over. And he wanted to open it up at night during certain days of the week so that people who worked till late could go and visit the memorial. And in one newspaper editorial, somebody wrote, who wants to go to a cemetery after dark? And his response was, I think, a very profound one. Yad Vashem is not a cemetery. It is a memorial for the living. And he is trying to develop Yad Vashem and make it into a center where people who have been ignoring the Holocaust in Israel and have been denying it in a particular way because of this machismo that I talked about earlier, will now become aware of what really happened. And so last fall, there was a week-long opening of the Yad Vashem during one of the festivals, one of the Jewish holidays, Sukkot. And one of the things that was done during that festival was to have one of the great singers of Israel, Chava Alberstein, sing East European Jewish music. The public response was overwhelming. Over 20,000 people attended. The media reaction was vehement. One TV reporter said, again, it was introducing music into a cemetery. And one of the writers in a newspaper in Israel wrote, this Yad Vashem festival desecrated the memory of the Holocaust far more than neo-Nazi attacks on synagogues and Jewish cemeteries in Germany did. So whatever you do, you're having a problem in trying to deal with the issue of the Holocaust. So there's Yad Vashem in Israel. There's Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day. There are these young novelists and short story writers bringing this to the attention of the public. There is, I think, a greater awareness and a willingness to deal with the issue today than there was in the past. And yet, as I said, there is this problem of people wanting to have a better life now and not think about war and destruction. And the response by Natan Sharansky, I think, was a very profound one. He said, if they don't want to have Hannah Senish as a hero, let them find somebody on the stock exchange to be their new hero. That is the sort of thing that some of the young people especially are going in for to a very great extent, something that's very new in Israel today. You never heard of the stock exchange years ago, and all of a sudden they found that in one military base on the northern border of Israel, right next to Lebanon, where there are constant attacks by the Hezbollah, half of the people in reserve duty there had their cellular phones with them so that they could make their deals on the stock exchange while on military duty. I don't think we have that here as yet. That's one of the little problems that has to do with this strange ambivalence that permeates Israeli society today. I'd like to read to you a couple of examples of poetry. Most Israeli-born poets have not dealt with the Holocaust. It's the novelists and short story writers who have. But one of the great heroes, still a hero of the Holocaust, was a man named Abba Kovner, who died just a couple of years ago. Abba Kovner lived in Vilna and was one of the leaders of the fight in Vilna against the Nazis. He was eventually able to escape, made his way to Israel, settled in a kibbutz, and wrote a number of very important pieces of literature. He wrote one series of poems which he called My Little Sister. Now, he didn't have a sister, but he imagines a sister who was killed in the Holocaust. Let me read just a few verses from this. My sister bride sits, a small dish of honey before her, such a huge crowd. Father twisted the braids of the challah. Art took his bread, bless God, 40 years from the same oven. He never imagined a whole people could rise in the ovens, and the world, with God's help, go on. My sister sits at the table in her bridal veil alone. From the mourner's hideout, the voice of a bridegroom comes near. We will set the table without you. The marriage contract will be written in stone. O lust for the hand of my sister, O one who closed in on her in the valley to kiss her on the mouth with no witness, with lips tasting clay, my bridegrooms, go, look for her now. We put her at the foot of the wall that understands silence. We put her on the mound like a naked stem. Blessed be he among men who will bring her into his chambers, my bridegrooms. Another poet, very important figure in Israeli literature today, another man who died, unfortunately, very, very young of cancer, a man who spent a year at Berkeley and enriched us tremendously during the period he was there, was Dan Pagis. Dan Pagis was born in Bukovina, which was then a province of Romania. He was born in 1930, which means that at the age of 10, he was put into a Ukrainian concentration camp, lost his family, was able to escape at the age of 14 in 1944, and somehow made his way to Israel. He wrote a number of very short poems. This is called Autobiography. I died with the first blow and was buried among the rocks of the field. The raven taught my parents what to do with me. My family is famous, not a little of the credit goes to me. My brother invented murder. My parents invented grief. I invented silence. All of you aware of who he's talking about here? What literary model he's taking? It's Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve. Afterwards, the well-known events took place. Our inventions were perfected. One thing led to another. Orders were. There were those who murdered in their own way, grieved in their own way. I won't mention names, out of consideration for the reader, since at first the details horrify, though finally they're a bore. You can die once, twice, even 7 times, but you can't die 1,000 times. I can. My underground cells reach everywhere. When Cain began to multiply on the face of the earth, I began to lie in the belly of the earth, and my strength has long been greater than his. His legions desert him and go over to me, and even this is only half a revenge. He wrote a very short poem that I find to be one of his most moving ones. I'll read it first in Hebrew and then in English because it's very, very short. Kan b'mishloach hazeh ani chava im hevel b'ni im tiru et b'ni hagadol kadam tagidu lo she'ani. Here in this carload I am Eve with Abel my son. If you see my other son, Cain, the son of Adam, tell him that the name of the poem is written in pencil in a sealed railway car. Finally, one called Testimony. No, they definitely were human beings, uniforms, boots. How to explain? They were created in the image. I was a shade, a different creator made me, and he in his mercy left nothing of me that would die, and I fled to him, floated up weightless, blue, forgiving, I would even say apologizing, smoke to omnipotent smoke that has no face or image. So, to conclude, in regard to the consciousness of the Holocaust in Israel, we have here such a variety of developments, of points of view from writers like this who are very popular writers in Israel. Poetry sells. It's not the sort of thing that you leave to a small coterie of people there. People know these poems. Sometimes perhaps they take them just as poems and not as stories that are true, that are part of experience. But then there are the young writers who are making their impact right now. And then there are the deniers and the people who say, why didn't they fight? And I think that that point of view will probably continue to exist for many, many years in spite of all. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
Perception. So what you pointed out was that there's a high general level of Holocaust consciousness at the same time as there is a relatively new desire to put the Holocaust into the past and to get on with normal life, Israelis wanting to be seen as normal citizens of the world rather than as something special, some people that need to remind everybody of their suffering, etc. And it struck me that essentially that attitude is exactly the same as what you find in Germany, in a general sense. A relatively high level of consciousness, part of the school curriculum and so forth, and there are articles about it all the time and TV programs and so forth. And yet when you talk with individuals, more often than not, the attitude that you'll hear expressed is, isn't it time now to put this behind us? Okay, let's not forget it necessarily, but after all, it's been 50 years.
I'm glad you brought that up, because this is exactly the response that many people are making in Israel to what's going on. And one of the things that they're saying is that our generation is so avid for acceptance into the world as normal human beings like everybody else, that they really do want to put all of this behind them. And that's what has to do with this putting down the heroes and heroines of the past. When young Israelis were asked recently, something over 1,000, there was just a spot survey, who were their heroes today? The first of the heroes was the Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, but the second was a rock star, an Israeli rock star, who sings, he's a punk rocker, who sings songs that encourage people to commit. And people were just overwhelmed by the fact that this person is looked upon as a hero by the young people. But what about the United States? I mean, if you were to ask who are your heroes and heroines, how many people wouldn't have, just a few years ago, I think she's passé now, but Madonna would have been close to the top of the list. There's no doubt about it. Or Michael Jackson, who again I think has gone down a bit. But there was no question a few years ago that some of the main heroes and heroines were part of popular culture and not the figures that we used to think about. Where's Lincoln? Where's Washington? Where's even Franklin Roosevelt and so forth? We have different heroes and heroines in a younger generation today. And that's what's happening in Israel. And I think it's something that pervades the world in many ways today. You had a question?
As an expert on Israeli life, could you say how the 50th anniversary of the end of the Third Reich and of the Holocaust is affecting any Arabic or Palestinian community?
Well, that depends very much on what their political views are and what their religious views are. Those who are Islamic radicals, first of all, deny that the Holocaust ever took place, and if it did, the Jews deserved it. So that, there's no feeling that there's any reason to single this out as a terrible event. You know that none of the Muslim countries have permitted Schindler's List to be shown, and the reason that they've used for not permitting it is that it has too much obscenity in it. They're so upset by the fact that some naked women are shown in the concentration camps that to them this is an obscene play. Well, obviously it was just an excuse not to show the film. Now, among the Israeli Arabs, now I'm talking now about those Arabs who are actually citizens of Israel, and there are about 700,000 of them. Their, again, views vary greatly, because just as you find Islamic extremists among non-Israeli Arabs, you'll find them among the Israeli Arabs as well. I met the head of the Islamic radical movement, what we usually call the Islamic fundamentalists, in Israel at a garden party one evening in Tel Aviv. I was there for a conference, and it dealt with the Arabs as a minority in Israel, and so he was invited, and I spoke to him at this reception, and I asked him what brought him to the to Islamic fundamentalism. Was he always, because this is a relatively new movement, certainly among Israeli Arabs, and he said, I used to be a communist. Now, you have to realize that in Israel, the Communist Party existed for one main reason, and that was to deny the existence of Israel. Because during the days of the Soviet Union, if you were a communist in Israel, it meant Israel didn't have a right to exist. And so if you wanted to be legitimate, and even vote for somebody who could sit in the Knesset, you joined the Communist Party or you voted for the Communist Party. He said, I voted for the communists, I was a communist, but then they became irrelevant. And so I looked around for something that was relevant, and so I became a Muslim fundamentalist, because that's me. That's authentically mine. Now, I'm sure that his views about the legitimacy of Israel, its right to existence, have changed in going from one extremist group, namely the communists, to the other, namely the Islamic fundamentalists. Those Arabs who don't belong to that particular view are extremely careful. They just don't want to have trouble, and so they don't express themselves regarding the Holocaust. Those are the places where you will not see people stopping work, standing still during the signal of Holocaust Day. So it's hard just how they feel and how they react to this whole thing. Okay, thank you very much.